Cool. Can you you should be able to see the Figma window. That's right?
Yep.
Cool. And so really I think Kyle alluded to it a little bit, but what we want to walk you through is not the entire design process, not the entire development process, but some of the things that we were able to do and collaborate with, especially early on in the project, to make sure that all of the designs and all of the patterns and all of the I won't go as far to say the design system, but all of the styles that we're using are consistent from what I was doing to what Kyle was actually developing in Webflow, and some of the tricks and things that we did in Figma along the way to help us out. So I will start by just kind of panning out and showing you guys just the homepage of this site that we did. And I won't stay here for too long, but especially if I pan all the way out, you can kind of see, it's your standard fare homepage with a lot of different sections on it. A lot of content that we're trying to get across here. But overall, nothing crazy about what we're doing here. But I want to start with the idea of what's in the title of this talk in the first place, is how you can leverage a style sheet to carry over into your Webflow work to try to either work faster or work more efficiently or just more consistently as well. So like I said before, I wouldn't say we created a design system here. I also wouldn't say we created kind of just the style sheet. It's probably somewhere in between one of those two. I think, Kyle, this site probably had, somewhere between 20 and 25 pages. So it was more than a landing page, but it was not, some sort of enterprise application or anything like that. But I guess without further ado, we don't have to stare at this homepage for too long. We can jump over to what I want to start with is where I kind of start my design process is, at least when I'm building out systems and sites like this, is developing some foundation and foundational patterns that will begin to apply to all of the work that Kyle does and all of the designs that we do for this particular site. And what I mean what I mean by foundations is kind of like the primitive elements. So things like colors, deciding on colors, things like deciding on which fonts you want to use, whether it's just one, it's a handful of fonts. Not only which font you use, but also what are the sizes of those fonts? What are the headings of those fonts? Are they, all caps? Are they lowercase? Are they sentence case? Driving through and driving home all of those little details and trying to define those as upfront as we can, so that everything we do moving forward cascades and works in line and just works together. Some other foundations that I'll go into a little bit detail of in a second here is layouts, whether you're using a grid or not when you're building it out in Webflow, spacing increments, being able to almost treat spaces or spacers as components and use those, again, in a repetitive fashion to make sure that everything you're doing is consistent, all the way through to like things like iconography and different types of iconography, sizes that we'll use throughout the site and things like that. So, and Kyle, just jump in whenever you feel free, because I don't want this to become too much of a Figma lesson or a design lesson, but yeah, like I said, you feel free to jump in whenever you want. But if I dive into kind of the first foundational elements, and I'll try to cover up the UI of Figma a little bit here. It was really
one thing I will say, if you bring up your pages again, one thing Mike does that as we were actually going through, I found it to be helpful. If you look on the left there, those dashes where he's got the pages that are just the dashes, like above foundations and below component, there's nothing on those pages. It's literally just to break up the visual of the screens. And so it just makes it easier. So now we've got these chunks of stuff. So if you are looking in Figma and you're trying to, I found that actually, I'd never seen that before. And it was helpful to me because it was like, oh, these are all the pages up above. And then he just has these blank dash, which is just a way to section things up. So if you're curious about what is behind those, nothing, it's just an organization thing. So
yeah,
in case anyone was thinking. Or why?
Essentially what it is it's a hack in Figma because they don't allow folders of pages or nesting of pages. So, if you see these things up here, these are the actual designs of each individual page that a divider. Then we've got some of the stuff I was talking about here and, some other stuff and exploration down here. But to get back into kind of where we started, Kyle worked with another branding firm and they had already defined a lot of the colors that we would use and, down to the hex color and down to exactly what we would need. But where they didn't push it as far to create all of these tints that you're looking at and also to blow out the secondary palette like you're seeing here. So why is this all important? Well, the way we created these in Figma, and this is kind of standard practice, is create these colors as, I'm going to get the word wrong. Well, color styles is what you could call it, but create each one of these colors as a style. So even though there's a hex code behind this blue color, we've styled it in a way where it almost works as a component. And so I can see on my right-hand column here, we have all of our colors. So we've got our primary colors, and then we can see that blue right here. And then we can see this actual color and then all of the tints that we've created below it. Now, if we wanted to edit this color and we said, hey, we want this to be this really crazy neon green, it's going to change it right here in the layout in the UI, but it's also going to change every place that we had that blue color. So Kyle, I think you're going to have to make your website green starting tomorrow, and it's going to have to look like this.
This is live. Okay, it's actually live linked. It's already up there.
But it's a pretty good example and a pretty easy example of how to use Figma to control global elements like that. And that will be kind of the theme of what we go through when we talk about these foundational components. Trying to build things once and then reuse them so that we don't have to change a color 150 times later on. So let me undo that. But really, yeah, so Kyle can take these colors, he can come right in here and he can import them into Webflow. He can use the inspect tab, which might be a little bit more important to show you on some other kind of nested elements, but all of that is kind of outlined right here. I don't know if there's another piece around color, Kyle, that you want to mention before I move over to type styles and things like that.
No, I think the only thing that I'd add is that, and this is true with everything that you're going to go over, and you kind of touched on it, is that there wasn't a spot in the design where you used a different color. There was, every time Mike ended up using a color, he either forced himself to use one that was there, or he created a new one and added it to the components and added it to the list. And so it was, he basically always used the things that were defined in this foundations. And that's the same with fonts. It was the same with spacings. It was the same with sizings. It was the same. So everything was always, every component of the actual designs, you could almost trace back to this foundation, this foundation page. So that would be the only, there was never a spot where there was like a different color that, and then all of a sudden I'm going, oh, what do I put here? So background colors, if sometimes you have like a lightly shaded background color, those were defined, it was often like blue 6 was a background color that was used a lot. And so that was why it was nice having those different shades, because you could have, different things. I'll stop. Keep going.
Yeah. And the important piece is too that, you don't just come into Figma and lay this stuff out in the first 10 minutes of doing it. There is design exploration that kind of happens ad hoc before this, just because as a designer, you need to understand what works and what doesn't work. So especially when we come over to these typography styles, I didn't just know what these should be right off the bat. It did take some exploration on my own time before we were locked in on what we knew worked and looked good and where it was placed and things like that. But what you're seeing is basically the outcome of that exploration and what these definitions are. So just like colors, just like we saw all of those different colors and how we can use those throughout all of the UI, same thing with fonts. So what this style sheet is aiming to do and helping Kyle with is to say, okay, we have a primary font where we're going to use the majority of the time. And we have a secondary font that we might use for body copy, buttons, captions, or other kind of secondary elements. Now, after defining those actual typefaces and fonts, we go a little bit further and give Kyle the specs around the headings. So, we looked at the pages that we had and kind of that exploration that I talked about before, and we essentially extrapolated all of the different headings that we were using and laid them out here so that what he is capable of doing is, instead of trying to have all of this back and forth and exploration in the Webflow designer, he can come right in here, click on one of these elements. If he wants to, he can go to the inspect tab and just pull all of that styling and all of that CSS and put it right into Webflow and not think twice about it. So that's, again, another kind of efficiency hack where if you can do some upfront work in this tool, it'll save you a little bit of exploration in the designer tool. But yeah, so a bunch of different headings listed out here. As we go a little bit further, you can see a couple different body styles. So there's going to be cases in the website we found out where we need a larger body copy font versus cases where we need a smaller body copy font. So there's kind of variables to body copy, and there can be variables to a lot of this different type size stuff, all the way through, what does a label look like, or what does a caption look like, and things like that. So trying to define as much as we can so that Kyle isn't sitting and developing this with a bunch of questions and having to come to me all the time saying, hey, what should I do here? And actually you can see a little bit of the collaboration here. So Figma, for those of you who haven't used it, very big collaborative tool. You can comment and you can kind of see right here. Let's see what you actually wrote, Kyle. I'm seeing we have a body large and a body small. Is there a regular? I need something for default. So we can have those conversations right in the tool. I can respond. You can kind of resolve a lot of issues through that, which is nice. But another kind of cool thing with Figma, and a lot of new tools do this as well. But it's a nice little thing to have. So outside of typography, one of the more important things, especially when you're building a site that has 20, 30 pages, is to lock down a spacing system. And you can kind of look at that from two facets. You could look at it from what you see up here, where you could actually go as far to define the underlying grid in the layout. And Kyle and I were talking about this, and Kyle uses Flexbox a lot in his designs. So while you can still use that with a grid, you can also use it without a grid, and you can kind of figure things out and place things on your own. So this grid in the end didn't really necessarily come into play too much. But if there was another designer who was using CSS grid, for the majority of their Webflow work, this could really help them. And maybe the better thing to show right now would be to go over to one of these layouts. And if I actually turn the grid on, you can kind of see how all the elements align to that. And then you could see as a Webflow developer, again, how this might help you with spacing or lack of questions around spacing, because a lot of this is predefined in the design file.
One thing to know, to just add, this is Figma. If you design in Sketch, if you design in XD, if you design in Illustrator or Photoshop, if you're wherever you're doing your layouts, the same kind of, I think these principles would apply. It's to what Mike's talking about. So if you're not a Figma person, you don't necessarily have to go out and switch to Figma just because of all this. You could do this in your program.
Right. And so outside of the actual grid that we were just talking about, I think one of the more important things is to define a system of spacing and a system of different sizes of spacers, let's just call them for now. And so obviously throughout web design and throughout the pages that we've been looking at, there's a lot of different space throughout. And what we don't want to be doing is having, 7 pixels of space in between a typography element, and then 11 here, and then like 17 over here. We want to be picking from kind of a preset amount of spacers. And I don't know how many we have off the top of our head here, Kyle, but I don't know, 10 or 12. But by having 10 or 12 of these, this gives us the flexibility to kind of create any layout we need, but also being consistent and avoiding those, one-off values. And Kyle, I think there was a piece around client first that you wanted to mention around the spacers here.
Yeah, I can kind of, I'll explain it in a bit, but basically Mike created these spacers and I used client first on the build. And so I came in and I actually updated the client first defaults to match this spacing. So I manipulated client first to make sure that it was going to fit because their spacings were off a little bit. Or not off. I mean, it's relative. It's not like they were wrong. It just didn't match. For those of you who are wondering, so how do you use spacers, right? Like, so my guess, like to give you an example, Mike, my guess is there's a certain space between that title spacing increments and that line. What is it? 96 maybe?
You're talking about this heading.
Yeah, like, so if someone's like, how do I actually use the spacers? Like, how do I use the spacers?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and you can do it a couple ways. You could actually create components out of these little squares and put them in your design and then build around them. That's a little tedious for me. And I kind of, after a day of working with these increments, I know them like the back of my hand. So I just use them that way. But yeah, there's a way to cheat and you could definitely do that.
So you're like, when you put that heading on and you want to make sure that where it's a spacing increments, you want to make sure it's far enough down from that line. What you're doing is what you're just.
So, well, let me try to explain this in a simple way, but all of these spacers are divisible by 8, and kind of a hack in Figma is you could change your nudge setting to 8 points instead of 10 points. So if I click on this and I'm clicking it up, it's going to go up by 8 every time. So I know I can do that math in my head and go really quickly about, how far I want things apart. But this is more of a guideline down here, just, as a reminder. And I'm not sure if I'm getting close to the answer to your question or not.
Well, what I was going to say is you can use if you hit option and you can see how far things are from each other.
Yeah. So as I kind of move this around too, you can see there's 24 in between all of these things, which means we're doing it the right way. But yeah, so spacing is kind of this invisible piece to your design, but if you don't have it, it can really break apart your design. And it's maybe one of the bigger things that can hold everything together, even though you can't see it.
Mm-hmm.
Lastly, we'll talk a little bit about iconography. So, the brand studio that we had talked about that did a lot of the upfront work for this company came up with kind of one set of icons, brand icons, let's just call them. And you can see they're a little bit more stylistic up here. There's a set of 6, but they're all kind of following the same pattern. The more important thing that we needed to decide and we wanted to define was not what they look like, but how do we use them? And a little trick we did was to come up with a preset of 3 different sizes of where you can use these things. So there's a little bit of guidance or guidelines around these, but basically what it says is if I want to use this green icon right here, you can use it at 120 by 120, the large size. You can use it at a medium size or a small size, but don't go off and start to put it at 45 by 45 somewhere, just because, again, we want to be as consistent as possible throughout everything we do. And then the brand company that we worked with did not come up with any additional icons. So what we did was find kind of an open source generic library that we're calling our utility icons. You can see these are, much more monochromatic and, much more simple, but we're following the same kind of guidance and guidelines here. So for each one of these icons, you can use them at a large size, a medium size, or a small size, but also there's a little note in here about the stroke weight of these fonts or of these icons. And, kind of the bend don't break rules of don't change the stroke size beyond a certain limit, and yada, 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 again, for the sake of consistency. So now on a really, really big site, these foundational elements can go on and on and on. You're looking at, 4 frames or 4 artboards of stuff here. I've worked on projects that have 10, 20, 30 of these, and they can go as far as to define elevations for shadows, to really you name it. But I think this is a kind of a good simplistic primer into how this stuff can carry over into the actual page and the UI design that you're doing.
Let's really quickly just dive into the components, just give a quick overview of that, and then we'll get into the build, because I think we'll start to see all these things come together.
Yeah, and I'll go super fast. I'll try to kind of gloss over this, but if you think of foundations as those primitive elements, like the colors and the fonts we're using, with the components area that we're just looking at right now, we are building components out of all those primitives. So we're building buttons with the blue color. We're building the label within the button is with the type that was defined on the foundations page. The iconography comes from what we just looked at as well. So you can see how, you have the smaller pieces that are building the larger pieces that are building eventually, full on cards and elements like we might see over here. For those of you who are not in Figma all day long, or maybe just getting into Figma and just starting, a while back, I don't know, maybe 6 months, 12 months ago, Figma introduced variants, and it's a really, really cool trick to kind of create one component, but as many variations of that component as you want. So a quick way to show that would be, let's say I want to place a button on this page. I can look up through my component kind of picker here. I can click large button. I can push this large button over here. And now we have our button. But what's behind the scenes of this button is every single one of these styles and variables of that button. So if you'll notice on this right-hand panel, if I click large button, and right here, these are all of the variables that I've set over here. So do I want this button to be solid, or do I want it to be an outline? Do I want it to be big or small? Maybe I want to add an icon to this button. And then maybe actually I want to show the hover state and not the regular state. It's kind of cool because all of this is nested into one single component, and you don't have to go looking for 40 different things. You'll find that as kind of a pattern throughout. So same with what do our text links look like? What do our tabs look like? You can kind of bundle all these things, and you can, I'm not sure if you can see it, but anything with this little purple dotted line around is a singular component with multiple variables, which is cool. As we go through though, same thing, all we're trying to do here is give Kyle a little bit of a head start. So what are our forms going to look like? What do they look like on the focus state, the disabled state, the error state? Same with checkboxes, toggles, switches, things like that. You can get as detailed as you really want with some of this stuff. And I realize I'm going quick, but here's some navigation components that we can reuse throughout the site. And then you can get all the way down into, styles of cards that you might use throughout the site. So this is an example of like an article or a resource that you might find. But the important piece is that we built this once here. We can really use it as many times as we want, just like we would a symbol in Webflow here. So you can kind of see those in action. And we only have to change these once, and it changes everything else. So there are similarities between what Figma is doing and what Webflow is doing, which I think is a good thing. But again, all in the effort to kind of streamline and make the actual build process a little bit more efficient. And I don't know if there's a ton else on components that I go into at this level, Kyle, but if there's something that you're thinking of that I didn't touch on, feel free to jump in and I can talk about that.
Yeah, no, let's dive into the build, and let's dive into the build, because then I think this will start to make sense. And what I'm realizing is I should probably open up that Figma file, but I think that's on a different account. So one second, let me just make sure that I have that Figma file up so we can jump back and forth if we need.
Quick question, is Figma still free?
It is. I think it's free to, it's kind of like Webflow. It's free to a certain amount of projects. And I think you're limited. You can't have teams and things like that. But if you're just getting into it, you can definitely learn the whole tool for free.
Cool.
Okay, so here we go. So here's the site. I assume you can see this. And to give people, actually, let's go here just so you can quick see. Here's the site. I spent a lot of time making it responsive, or not responsive, accessible. So you can do it with your deal. But you can see here what we've got is we've got all of, like, you know, the utility icons, all of those fonts. So it's really everything that Mike put together. Now in Webflow, what I did was I created, and what I'm actually going to talk, like, I'm not doing, like, from a Webflow standpoint, there's nothing really that's super crazy, you know? So I think a lot of the stuff is maybe just reinforcing what maybe you've heard before, or maybe you're already doing this stuff. But so that's kind of, I didn't like create some like magic hack that it just saves a bunch of time. But what I did do was I've got my styles and my components. So if we come down here to the styles page, like I said, I used client first. So client first has the styles page. Now, as you do with Webflow, you know, you style your base headings to make sure that you're not necessarily creating a class for your heading. You're actually styling the base heading. So I did all of that. Now, one of the time savers though, that I did do that I was really happy with and glad I did was like, I styled all my heading elements, but then I actually created classes for those styles as well. So you can see here, I've got heading H1, heading H2, heading H3, because sometimes in your design, or from an SEO standpoint, it's not good to skip heading levels, right? You don't want to go from an H1 to an H3, or an H1 to an or an H2 to an H6, or, you know, you want to step down. But sometimes from a design standpoint, that doesn't really make sense. Like the design didn't work out that way. And you try to maybe minimize those things, but sometimes you just can't. And so what I did was I created all of, even though the elements are styled up here as the base styles, I did create the heading styles as well. So that allowed me, if I needed to go from H1 to H2, but that H2 was actually styled as something different, that allowed me to apply that class. And then it looked like it matched the thing. So that was one thing that I did that I was really glad that I did was I effectively duplicated all of these headings with a class. But then you'll see, I just went right down the line, and in this styles page, I recreated everything that Mike had built on his foundations page, right? I've got my display, I've got my heading, I've got headings, body large. I ended up actually using this one as the regular, and this is the small, but I've got text size large, regular, compact, and then I built out the labels. I built out label small, button, navigation, all of these things. And the thing that Mike did in his design was on all of the pages, like you can click on any one of these pages. And if you can see that this is desktop heading 5, desktop body small, desktop heading 2, every single one of the text elements is using a style that he created. So he's just pulling this from his list of styles, right? Desktop label button. So what I was able to do is when I was building out this page, I could look at the design and say, oh, I need desktop body small. And so then I come over to Webflow and I'm building my page and I know that I've got that class. The other thing I did was I tried to, as much as possible, use the same names as Mike. So when he called something over here in his foundations, when he called it, label regular, label button, label navigation, in Webflow, I was also calling it that. So I didn't have to remember like which one is that again? So I matched his names to I matched my names to his name. Then also on the spacings, let me show you here's the colors. I recreated all the colors. And I'll show you something I did with the FinSuite extension, but I recreated all the colors. So I have everything that he has. Created the buttons, every state of the button, every version of the button, tags, hover states. Here's my icon size. I basically spent a lot of time, probably the first maybe day, just recreating all the stuff he did. And then I was able to fly. The thing though that I also did was, I think we're starting to get into some spacings here: margin large, margin medium, margin small. Client First has a way that they like to name things. It's like extra, extra huge, huge, extra, extra large, large, medium, extra, so they've got their names. Mike didn't originally have that on his spacing. He called them something else. And so I came up here and I renamed all of his stuff to match Client First, so that when if I ever needed to see something, or if I ever needed to check a size, I knew that the sizings, I could just say, oh, this is 96. Okay. Well, 96 is huge. Cool. Now I'm on my way. So that really helped as well, making sure my names in Figma were the same as my names in Webflow. Then I had a components page where I actually created a few of the things that he created. So I put I created obviously my navigation, but then he had a few different versions of these people, right? One was a big picture, one was a medium picture, one was a small picture. So I recreated those. I recreated the different components. So I recreated a lot of these things, these brand elements that we pulled through. This was actually kind of nice. I had created this as a symbol, and then I'd actually unlink the symbol because I would have accent triangles large. And then if I ever wanted it to be blue, I would make the main color is the Christensen CG. So, but then there's is business insurance, is benefits insurance, is the personal insurance color, is the life color. If you're seeing I'm just adding a combo class to basically change the color of these things. And so I built out some of these symbols and then would unlink the symbols and then just add a combo class. And now I've got a whole new color or a whole new, size or whatever. So I made some of these components that Mike made. I made the form, made the intro section. Two things that I'd say, and then I think we'll kind of maybe pause for questions. I created a blank symbol. Let me see if I can find it. I'll just put it on a page somewhere. We'll put it on our privacy policy page. So here, let's say I'm on this page. I created a blank symbol, blank section. And what it did was, in my blank section, I would then unlink it. And what I have the Client First structure all set up and ready for me. So what I would do is, when I'd build out my page, I'd throw on a blank symbol. I'd maybe copy, or I'd look and I'd say, oh, I need 5 of these things. And so I would paste 5 of those. And now I can name my, my section. I can do the whole Client First thing, but that was also really handy. And lastly, I also, in my color palette, I downloaded you'll notice I've got the FinSuite thing, and one of their deals is the color swatch reorder. and I arranged my color palette. If you can see that, I arranged my color palette to, where are we? To match how Mike had it. So it was really easy for me if I looked at something and it was like, oh, that's a blue shaded 10. I know that I come right to the blues and I go down to 10 or 6 or 20, or I need a gray 80, dark gray 80. Okay, I'm right there. So I set up all my colors so that it was really easy for me to pick them out. And I didn't have to like search around, because you can imagine if these wouldn't have been organized, I'd have no idea which was which. Even some of these, I'd have no idea which was which. So organizing these in a way that made sense, I could then more quickly find them. I did that using the Fin Suite color swatches reorder. And what I did was I had to add some placeholders. I had to do it a couple times to make sure that it turned out all right, but I got it in a nice spot that I'm excited about. So that was really helpful as well. Let's pause there, because I think we've probably hit our time. I'm gonna stop unless someone has feel free to turn on your mic and ask questions, and we can if you have questions about Figma, I can pull up the Figma document or Webflow, but that hopefully that was helpful. I don't know. Basically what ends up happening is Mike creates things in a way that he didn't really ever deviate from. And then I was able to come in and just make sure that I was always using what he had. And there was no there were no slight deviations from what Mike did, because he always used this, this consistent thing. And then I was able to create all those consistent things and then just start kind of Lego piecing my build together.
I have a question for Mike. It was really fun to see that all put together. It was so organized and clean, especially with the style sheets. When you're doing the creative process and you're creating those layouts, sometimes there's a push and pull with the design and those final style guides. Did it look that good when you started, or do you kind of clean it up at the end? How do you sort of manage sort of the creative exploration with the very clean, tidy, orderly final result that you'd want to have at the end?
Yeah, it's a good point. And ultimately, you don't get in day one and have that clean style sheet. It's just, it doesn't work that way. And I don't know how many days it probably took, but there probably is a solid week of taking the brand standards and the materials that we have and what we know this brand needs to look like, and then actually getting in and playing around with layouts. And when I'm doing that, I'm not thinking so much about spacing. I'm not thinking so much about, oh, this type has to be 72 pixels. I'm just trying to figure out what looks best and what works together best. After a certain amount of time and maybe a certain amount of screens that you pulled together, you can almost call them, proof of concept or conceptual screens. Then you can align on that direction. And that's probably a good time to meet with Kyle or your client and say, hey, here's where we're trending. If you get buy-in, then that's probably when you can begin to really create all of those styles and those definitions that will cascade to, the other 20 pages or the other 30 pages or whatever, the project is that you're working on. So it takes a little bit of, bending and breaking before you'll get there, but it's kind of the natural part of the design process.
Because Mike and I had worked together on dozens of projects beforehand, and I'm comfortable in Figma. I think Mike probably let me behind the curtain a little bit more than he might have if I was a different client. And what I could say is that now it seemed like everything Mike was talking about, it's this exploration, and then you start to, like you said, it starts to codify. And actually then what happens is you get to this point where you start to blow out the other screens and define the other screens. And then it goes through kind of, there's almost like a little messy phase of you thought you had everything. And then you're like, oh, well, we actually need something for this. And oh, well, that doesn't really work in this. And so all of a sudden the thing that you had and you thought was like the thing still like gets a little messy and you need to tweak it. And then probably I would say towards the end, or if there's like a final deliverable, Joy, I know you're really, really good at like delivering to the client. Like this is your thing. Like here's your brand. Here's all your, there would probably be some cleanup in beforehand to make that work, to make that as good looking as you like to make it. There, you'd probably need to do a little more, but what's nice is you could export those as PDFs right out of Figma and you're basically done, right?
I have a question. Do you guys hear me?
Yep.
First of all, wow, like just phenomenal work. And this is just like, I'm just soaking this up. I noticed in Figma, I had a question real quick because I'm kind of designing in a bubble right now. With auto layout, is there like a point where there's too much auto layout? Like I noticed you were moving some of your stuff with in frames, and it's easier to manipulate the spacing probably. And sometimes I get auto layout, and I don't know if you had any advice there.
Yeah, so I've met, two types of designers. One of them who they live and die by auto layout. And if you ever go into their design files, you will feel stuck in like you're breaking everything that they've ever made because everything is an auto layout. And the other type is the person who doesn't use it at all because they just kind of wing it and they throw stuff around and, they just want to do what looks good to them. And I think both of those neither of those are wrong. Myself personally, I use auto layout in kind of specific instances and for things that I know need certain constraints like cards or things that have, a couple different elements working against each other. But, I'd say for the other 40–50% of a lot of the things we're doing, I'm not using auto layout. So just like in Webflow, there's probably 25 ways you could build one thing. I think to some extent, you can say the same about Figma. Use it as much as you're comfortable with it and use it where it might save you time in terms of, repetitive elements or consistency and things like that. But I've seen a lot of back and forth in the design community about it. And I'm not one way or the other. I think, use it to how you see fit.
What about I noticed in Webflow how you had the spacings in the style sheet. Are you just dropping those div blocks in as the spacing, or are you just using that as like a guide for your margins and your padding?
In Figma or in Webflow?
In Webflow. And then I'm sorry if it's a stupid question.
No, so with client first, they have a spacing system. So you could be like padding top, extra huge. You had padding top.
Okay.
And then your next in your combo class is like extra huge. And then that's basically a class that says I need padding top of a certain amount. If I wasn't using client first, I probably would create those classes, right? I would have somehow created that so that I could just quickly add some paddings and margins and widths and different things. The thing that I did run into with client first, and I'd be curious, I know Adrian, at one point you said that you were like, the jury was still out for you on client first. And so I wanted to talk to you about it. There's a lot of classes and there's a lot of divs. And so if you can get in a rhythm, it's all right. But every once in a while, there'd be a point where I'm adding 6 classes and then I've got to go do the fin suite, like, combine all these classes together and then what's the new class that I want to create. And then it's got to refresh. And so it did slow down. Like there were times, and then because I've now created this brand new class that has all of those classes combined into one class, I have effectively lost the the power of being able to manipulate just that one class from before that will now, I feel like I've just explained like Inception. But you see what I'm saying? Like when you combine the classes, you end up, like if you change a base class, now it doesn't apply to the new class. But anyway, Adrian, I was curious to hear if you feel differently about client first, if you're excited about it, if you're not, do you use it?
I have been using it more. I don't know if I'm getting more comfortable with it. I still, as you just described, that scenario drives me crazy. The other thing that really took me a long time to adopt was how many nested divs they use for everything.
Yeah.
Sometimes I say, I just want to use a combo class and not have 6 divs nested inside when I can just put one combo class on the container and it does everything that those nested spacing divs do. I think I've adopted the client first naming system, and it's kind of a hybrid system of what I was doing, like a BEM atomic style material design, not more than Bootstrap or what's the other, Tailwind framework. I know I used to talk to Joe Krug a couple of years. I still talk to him, but a few years ago, FinSuite was based on like a Bootstrap style BEM naming system before they got into the client first. I think that's more their chief developer, Alex. I think that's his baby. He kind of brought that in. Yeah, there's a couple things I just have not been able to like 100% adopt. I'm probably still like at 95%. And the other things I just do my way. But I've worked on like 3 different projects where some other developers started using it off a client first template. And then halfway through, they just started leaving like div 246. And then I'm coming in there and I'm like, yeah. And I'm going in there and I'm trying to fix all the stuff that they didn't quite finish or they didn't, there was this one site I was working on where I had all these client first attributes for filtering, but they never got it working. And I'm sitting there looking at stuff and trying to figure out what they got right and what they stopped, what they stopped at with completing it and what was broken. That they didn't get right, so yeah, I've had that. And then there's another site where the guy hired me. He had built his own website for his startup, and he's an engineer, and he was his naming system was interesting. Let's just call it interesting. But he had watched some FinSuite videos, and he's looking for someone who knew client first, so he wanted me to come in there and rebuild some of the pages that were there, build some new pages to replace some of the other ones. And I was constantly fighting between the classes that they had already there and putting in new FinSuite.
Yeah, because if you start monkeying with stuff, it's like whack-a-mole. It's the one thing that it's one of the things that really bugs me about Webflow. I hope, Corey, you're taking notes here. That it'll, like, if I type a class, it'll be like 2 on this page, 3 on other pages. Yeah. And I want to know what other pages, because if you're telling me that it's on other pages and it's on like my components, that's save as draft page, I don't care. Or if it's on my like privacy policy page, probably don't care. Right? Like I'll fix that. But if you're telling me something that's on like my blog page, right, that it like is, and then I'm like, oh wait, that's gonna, okay. Sometimes I feel, and so Adrian, not to cut you off, but like when you start monkeying with other people's classes, I feel like I don't know what's gonna end up happening. Like it's gonna, all of a sudden.
Yeah, a lot of times I was duplicating something that they had in there and then renaming it so that I wasn't going back and breaking it, but then you lose some of the modularity that you were talking about. But yeah, I cleaned that out and there was 729 classes I got rid of. It was ridiculous.
Are you ever nervous about deleting, curious, and this is a question for the group, are you ever nervous about deleting a class that for some reason is maybe like applied it's applied on an interaction, or it's I guess what I'm trying to say is do you just go up and you're like, yep, clean out all my unused CSS classes. You don't worry about it. You just do it. Or
Actually, it's one of my favorite things to do. I love it.
and you're not ever worried that you're going to delete something that matters.
No, then you just fix it. But I get real satisfaction from clearing out the classes. I really don't know what it is. Clearly, maybe I just don't quite know enough about web design to understand the implications. So I'm like, yeah.
Ooh, style manager, Corey. Mohammed, do you have a question? Did you want to jump in?
No, I was like about to mention that you can now find the classes like on which page they are currently used on, and you have a button right here. So you can click over that class and it will take you to that page.
Love it.
Fantastic.
Corey just sent a link too.
Yeah, I think Corey says the basic.
Mohammed's referencing.
Yeah. Yeah, what Corey was basically what Mohammed said. Yeah.
I can't wait to dig into that.
Yeah, and I mean on the clearing classes, this is yes. So like both in in any site I work on, we always have some kind of a style page system, like kind of like you were showing, just a style guide. And we always have a utilities section or page. And then on that utilities page, there's a prevent delete section that, like, if you are going to build something that you're going to use in custom code, it is your responsibility to go paste that element there to make sure that it cannot be cleared, because you can get into a lot of tech debt without having that best practice, where it'll be what was mentioned, thousands of unused classes that you're too afraid to clear because it might break something unknown. And yeah, it's I feel like it's all about getting ahead of it.
That was why in my components page, I pasted my navigation in there, because I actually had to build that whole thing using, I had to rebuild that whole navigation. I couldn't do it with the native nav and native dropdowns. And so I had to build the whole thing with custom interactions. And I was adding and removing classes, but by default, those weren't on there. So that's why, exactly what you're saying, I was going, I know that if I clean out my classes, my whole navigation is going to get screwed up. And so Rachel, it wasn't quite as easy. Oh, then we'll fix it. I'm going with the navigation. I can't screw up my navigation.
Glass half empty, this crew. But okay, so if I understand correctly, it's basically like if you build something, you have a set style kind of organized in advance for the spacing, and then for whatever reason you delete a page because you want to rebuild it, something isn't appearing on the site and it comes up as unused, and you clear it out, and then actually it's like a valid component to the styling system. Is that okay?
Or the thing that Corey brought up that was probably more likely is that there's something you can't really do in the designer, and so you have to write custom CSS, and so you're like triggering you're like calling a class or something, and so you've got to write custom CSS that doesn't really, maybe it's I use it for like selecting child elements, like nth child, and so yeah, I don't know, I'm not explaining that well, my brain can't work, sorry. Corey, maybe you have a better way of explaining it.
No, it's great. I was just gonna say, I mean, something I'm hoping for is a future ability of being able to like lock classes so that you can prevent things like this. Like your use case, I have also used a lot, where you want to add and remove classes with some JavaScript or something, and you don't want those shown in the designer because they're only for a state. And so that, and just even, I think some of the risks in building with systems like this, but I say risks in the reality because building with systems is the way. It's easy to, like you had mentioned, combining classes and things like that. Like that is the power. And so whatever you can do to prevent or keep that power and prevent errors and things is huge. And so hopefully there will be features in the future that will enable some of that, right? So that you can have a little bit more control over those things, but we'll see.
Yeah. One thing I liked about the Figma file system that Mike was using, other than having those little divided empty page dashes to break up the pages, that was I haven't seen that before, but and this is kind of related a little bit to FinSuite because they are only doing development, they're not doing design anymore. And I like to do design and development, but I've been working on a number of projects lately where I'm the developer. I'm not have anything to do with the design other than maybe I might say a suggestion. And yeah, sometimes the frames are named, sometimes they're not, but none of the groups, none of the sections inside there are named. And what I really hate is that whenever I'm not a Figma expert, but I like to have the hierarchy in the structure on the side panel to go from top to bottom and not from bottom to top. And most people are building it, the top item is actually at the bottom of the Figma file because that's the first thing that they built, and then everything gets built on top of it. And no one ever drags that stuff back to the top to have the hierarchy. So your footer is like at the top of your frame, and your header's down at the bottom, and all the other sections are in reverse. So just hunting for those sections when they're not named, clicking on them, like, am I in the right one? Am I in the right group inside? Is this the right card inside that group? Because nothing's named. I really appreciate, I mean, you must appreciate working with Mike just for that sort of organization.
Well,
level.
it wasn't me. It was there were like 200 developers we worked with that probably drilled it into him. So I didn't have to say anything.
Yeah, I think some designers are just born with it where they need to be organized like that. But it's something that none of these design programs have solved really. Sketch never did it. XD never did it. It's probably a very complex thing to solve as well. But the thing I hate is I'll have groups named, and if I ungroup that group just once, the name goes away. Yeah. And if I regroup it, it's group number 471 or something like that. So it's little pet peeves and things like that, but yeah.
And the other thing, I really appreciate the 8-point spacing and the ratios. I've been working on files where the spacing is like 37 instead of like, why not 36? Why not 40? Why 37? And then the next one's 33. Like, why aren't they both 37 or both 33? Yeah. It just drives me.
Or both 36. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a thing that going from pixels to rems, it worked out because Mike was doing the 8-point. I didn't even think about this, but Mike was already doing the 8-point pixel thing. So when client first is saying do rems, and my base font was 16 pixels, it worked out really nice having the 8-point. But go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say something similar. There's a lot of similarities across typography and spacing, and they might not be exactly the same, but there's a lot of patterns you can follow between the two.
Have you ever seen those, or has anyone ever used them where there's like this like typography sizing like methods, and it's like the rule of thirds, or like this is the quarter fifths or whatever, and then it's like yeah. Have you seen those? Do those work? Are they good?
Major I don't know. Third. So some of them are pretty reasonably thought out. So like major third is like 1.25. And like the Fibonacci golden rule sequence is like 1.618 or something like that. So like a fourth is like 1.33. So, I mean, a lot of times you're already thinking a little bit like that, maybe anyways, where you're going from 32 to 40, that's probably 1.25. That's probably a major third ratio there.
Yeah. Or
like the Fibonacci sequence, you're kind of adding things to the previous two. So you can go from 16 and then your next one's 24. So then you add 16 and 24 and get 40 for the next one. And then 40 and 24 for 64 is your next one.
Whoa.
I have a newbie question real quick. So like I read something because I thought it's important to do accessibility with UX design. And they said like, oh, you should use rems for type and whatnot. So I guess if you do 62.5% as your base pixel, then your rems are exactly, so 1.6 rem would be 16 pixels. So when I was coding, I was doing everything in rems, but then now I'm doing it in Webflow, and everything seems to be in either pixels or ems. Is that like normal? I don't know.
You can use rems in Webflow.
But it seems like it automatically defers to pixels. Is it okay to do that? Okay.
You can set your base body. If you set your base body font to 10 pixels instead of 14 or 16, you can use
Then
that
it's like that.
0.65 ratio. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Wait, what is that?
So Webflow, I think the default font size is 14 if you don't change it. Most people use 16 because that's the typical browser size, and it works with the 8-point ratio. So if you're doing what he was talking about with the 0.625 to find out, so you're, instead of thinking it like at 20 is 1.25 rems, you're just calling it 2 rems because you're using it, the base font, as 10 pixels. So you don't have to do the math. You can go 16 is 1.6.
I want
36 is
38.
3.6 rem.
I see.
Instead of one, that would be like 2.25 rem.
So if I wanted a margin, a top margin of 100 pixels, I would do 10 rems.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the old Zerb Foundation format or framework was built on that same kind of thing.
Zerb?
Oh yeah. So way back when
What
there
was
were
Zerb?
Skeleton. So Skeleton was one of the first responsive frameworks, but Zerb was one of the second ones, even before Bootstrap. And it was basically a whole, CSS framework system for building sites. Yeah, and that's what I spent years working in. And it was all built on rems, but they did that whole 62.5% body size, or right on the HTML. So that then everything was just a simple multiply by 10. I'd forgotten all about that, actually.
They're still kind of establishing, there's no consensus, right, on what the correct metric is for it. They just kind of run through trends, and some people prefer some things, and then it kind of ebbs and flows, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Right now they're saying that rems is the most accessible.
Yes.
Is it because if you all you have to do is alter the base font size, and then you're going to change and then your whole site shrinks up or down based on what you do there? Is that right?
Yeah, that and the browser, the user's browser, right, reacts happily to that. Whereas back in the old days, if everything was built in pixels, it didn't necessarily respond.
It had to go through. I see.
Yeah.
I did rems for this project that I just showed. Once there's a little bit of like, okay, what am I dealing with here, right? And I'm like, so some of them is like, oh, that's 3.125 rems, right?
Mm-hmm.
That one's 3.25, or that one's 3.5, or that one's 1.5. You start to figure out like, oh, okay. And I'm thinking in my head, oh, that's like 14, because Figma doesn't do rems. And so I'd look and, the design says 14 pixels. And so I'm going, oh, okay, that's 0.875 rems.
Mm-hmm.
You start to.
Yeah.
So by the end, it wasn't a problem at all.
Yeah. Corey, could you send this one back to the team? I would think it would be great if there was a way within the system that we could set whatever we wanted our base measurement to be, so that you could say, okay, on this site, I always want everything to start with, sorry about that. Hang on. I want rems to be the thing that it defaults to. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. And I know there's been talks of even just like ways along those lines to like set kind of standard styles a bit easier. Like, like, of course you can build a style system and you can set everything to rem manually, but like being able to have a place that's more of like an easy, quick starting point that like globally changes, yeah, it would be super interesting.
Yeah.
I feel
Because
like
otherwise,
that.
every time you have to come up to something, it's like, all right, I got to type rems in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This also seems like something that maybe, not that this is a cop out because I agree it should be native, but the FinSuite team and their extension, you know, like those are the types of things that I feel like they could maybe even solve, as well as like, you know, just
Oh.
detecting all those units. I feel like there's a form somewhere on their site or somewhere that you can submit ideas for the extension, but I don't
Yeah,
remember.
there
Maybe
is
it's even,
somewhere.
yeah.
Yeah. I can't remember where exactly, but yeah.
So I'm curious, is anyone using a design program other than Figma? And if so, what is it? And I'm curious if you like it.
Actually, I wanted to say something what just Corey just mentioned about FinSuite. They did add under the extension a pixel to REM migrator. So you could actually select that tab and it will read your layout, but it will change everything. It will change it in interactions. It will change it anywhere that is using pixels to REM. If that's something you want as a global change.
And it'll actually go through and update your settings, update
Yeah,
the
it will
styles.
update everything. It'll update your root, font size, and anything that's using pixels will be changed to REM. Yeah.
Wow.
Cool.
Go
Yeah.
I
FinSuite.
have run into a couple of points where using rems doesn't work on interactions and you have to use pixels or percentages.
Yep. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or you want to go to auto, you know, you want to like, hey, I shrunk something and now I want it to just go to what it should be, but you have to start, I think you have to start in pixels in that situation. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. On those accordions. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. So
Yeah,
I run into
Kyle,
that.
I just wanted to ask Mike, I'm going to the Figma layout. I noticed that they only did desktop. Do you guys go through the actual, all the breakpoints, like let's say tablet and mobile? Because I use Figma with a breakpoints plugin, and it saves me a lot of work before I go into Weflow or Visual Code or anything, any kind of development.
Yeah, what we didn't show it. Maybe we should have, but yeah, don't show me that score though.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my God, we're winning. Oh wait,
yeah,
were
you
you DVRing it?
maybe.
Oh no, I ruined it.
At least we're winning. This is okay.
Yeah.
I am so sorry that I just did that.
That's okay.
Kyle.
I think what I was going to say is, you know, Kyle and I have worked enough together where we're not going to sit down and do all sorts of different breakpoints, but what we did choose to do was take a handful of key screens from the desktop layouts where, you know, were maybe some more complex screens, or we knew that there are going to be more complex interactions on, and we did the mobile breakpoint for that. But we didn't do tablet. We didn't do anything between mobile and desktop, but at least this at a minimum was enough to give him a leg up and give him, you know, enough information to start putting this together and kind of creating it that way. So
Honestly, when I am working with designers, I tell them I don't need every break. Like if you look at, like, here's our server, I know what this is going to do, right? There's not too many things that this is going to do. So you kind of know what that's going to do. Eventually these are going to stack on top of each other, right? This is going to shrink down. They're all eventually going to go single column. And so I don't necessarily need Mike to show me that these three things are going to stack on top of each other. The thing that I do want to know though is like the homepage was a good example where we had these tabs, right? And eventually when this shrinks down, the tabs are they're going to be too wide for the screen. What should we do? And my my Neanderthal brain was like, what are we going to stack these things? Are we going to hide it? I don't know. And Mike comes in, he's like, well, let's just like, and he showed it here. He's like, well, let's just, let's just scroll it off the screen so that people know and everyone knows that they can, there's a scroll. So it was perfect. Like I turned that into a scroll, and now when you're on there, so that's the thing that I care about, is like those tough spots where it's like, what am I going to do here? Otherwise, there's generally only there's one way it's going, right? So I know you were asking Mike why he didn't do more, but part of it was, I think, me just saying, I don't need that.
I think the other thing too is if you're used to client first now, that it does an awful lot of that work for you, the sort of standardized kinds of changes that it'll make.
I had a small client first question for you, Kyle, but I also had a larger Webflow / Figma question that ties back to what you were asking about what people were using, whether they're using Figma or something else. And I kind of want to circle back to that and just see what people say there, just because my impression is that anyone who's designing who uses Webflow uses Figma. I feel like everyone uses Figma, but is it actually just because I almost exclusively talk to people who build in Webflow and people who like Webflow like Figma? And is it actually kind of niche? Like if I go somewhere else and I talk to non-Webflow people, are they going to be not using Figma? I don't know. I don't know what the landscape's like. So I was hoping there were some opinions on that too.
It might have something to do with how long somebody's been designing. I was watching a course the other day, and the person was using, I think they're using XD, right, which is Adobe. And it really, so it depends on, if somebody's been doing design work for a number of years and is really comfortable with the tool, there's no need for them to necessarily change to Figma just because that's what we use with Webflow.
Does it have a special relationship? Sorry,
It not necessarily. It doesn't. I don't think. A lot of people will use XD because it comes with this Adobe CC suite, right? And they don't need anything else. But I could tell you that in the past 4 years of my professional career, I've used XD, I've used Sketch, and now the past 2 years have been about Figma. So it changes that quickly too. And I don't know how long Figma will be the king in this space, but something new will come along sooner than later. So Figma's just probably, I think Figma's the most popular right now because you have all of the big tech companies out west and all of the big, any design company is probably using Figma over anything else.
Well, and I mean, Figma's, sort of continued to add more features to allow you to do more, of that prototyping and things like auto layout and stuff like that sort of gets you that much closer to your actual build. And the others are just still catching up with that.
The other interesting thing that maybe Figma's going through is, or will head, I don't know, but as they add more stuff, just like as Webflow adds more stuff, it becomes less and less beginner. It becomes less and less something that you can just kind of like pick up and like, oh, I'm going to go do that. Like I've been using Figma now for several years, and like once they introduced auto, because I'm not like a designer, like I can like work my way around in there, but because I'm not a designer, I've like fallen behind on like auto layouts, and sometimes people will send me stuff and I'm like, I don't even know how to edit this anymore. And so it's an interesting thing how something that makes a tool really popular, Webflow, was this thing that was like, oh, look at how easy it is. I can build a landing page and I can like do these things. And in order to satiate the appetites of their of just their users, I suppose, they need to add more stuff. And eventually you get to the point where it's like, hopefully you are along for that ride, that, the ride to complexity, because if you're starting, it can be overwhelming. for example, Mike is just starting Webflow a month ago, and it's really overwhelming, you know, like there's a lot of things that, you know, I take for granted that, you know, Mike's been asking, and they're normal questions, but it's, yeah, it's just an interesting challenge, I suppose, that SaaS companies have to figure out. My blood pressure right now is through the roof because I'm watching this game and there's 8 seconds left. So I apologize if I'm not
I can't believe that you succeeded to talk for so long whilst this was winding down so dramatically.
It was a commercial.
Okay. Now it's ended.
You know, I was looking now, we had a 13-point lead in the fourth quarter, which is now gone again.
You see the score?
Yes.
Oh my God, we're down by 3.
I tortured myself last night with the Nets, with the Brooklyn Nets. I saw an 18-point deficit go down to 3. I was like, oh my God, they're into it. And it's like the first game I watched in the whole series because I had my doubts that they will win. And I was like, oh, maybe I should have never watched the game. Maybe they will won.
Oh my God! Ah!
I must be on a
hit a 3 to tie it with 3 seconds.
Did they tie it?
Oh!
Okay, good.
The Ant-Man. Okay, I'm sorry. We're here. We're present. We're doing this Webflow for life. Anyway, any final thoughts? Any design questions? Any tips? Any thought? Anything?
I have a quick question for the Figma users. Do you have any issues with font syncing, specifically with Adobe Illustrator? Obviously, Google is a dream, Google Fonts. But yeah, I don't know. I've tried everything. It's fine now, but there'll be times where it just blacks out. So I don't know if you ever have that issue. Sometimes it's like you almost can't design with some fonts because it just won't work in Figma. I don't know if that's just me.
Are you saying you can't even find the font?
It's saying like Sorel, whatever, Adobe is not, I don't own the font when I clearly do own the license, that kind of thing.
You have it installed on your font book on your computer?
Mm-hmm. And Adobe Illustrator, but maybe I'm the only one. But
yeah, I don't know. Go ahead, Corey.
I was just going to ask, do you also use the desktop app or in a browser?
I only use the browser. I haven't used the desktop app before. Maybe that's the trick.
Yeah, you could try that. Do the like Mac desktop app or whatever. I feel like I've had better luck having less font issues because I feel like I know what you're referring to. I've experienced this before.
Yeah, I Googled quite a bit to see what other people were doing. So, and downloaded a plugin and a couple things, but I don't know.
Yeah, Figma has a built-in font manager as well. That it gives you the option once you bring it into your desktop to either install it. So if you're using a browser, maybe that's why. Because if remember that the fonts that you have in Creative Cloud are licensed to Adobe from another foundry, text foundry. So now they have to extend that license over to you, and going to Figma through another browser, that's another hurdle and license wall that they have to break through for you to use it for your projects.
That makes sense. That could be it too.
Yeah, I've seen 2 issues with Figma, and one is, and a couple other people have mentioned this to me. I thought it was just me and my eyes, but the color in Figma sometimes doesn't look the same in Webflow because for some reason Figma is slightly more saturated or something. And then the other thing is when you're exporting images, I found if you want to do PNG images export, you have to do it if you're designing on Retina displays. If you do the one-time file size, you have to do it at two times file size. Otherwise, your images are going to be blurry on Retina screens. So I was downloading them as one time, thinking they're going to be a smaller file. I can upload them directly into the website, Webflow assets panel. And I won't have to spend a whole time optimizing them because they look great in Figma when you zoom in, but then I actually get them on the site and like, what the hell? These look like shit. So then I have to download them at 2 times, and then they're huge files. They're all 800 megabytes or 1.3 megabytes or something. And then I have to take them into Photoshop and resize them to the size that the one time was, except they're at 144 pixels, and
because
you get like a clear file.
You're saying the resolution of the actual photo.
Right.
Oh.
Speaking of images, so I've been really getting into SEO lately and doing some courses. So some of my sites, they're really designer heavy. I work with a lot of interior designers. So obviously there's big pictures and you're trying to get them as small as possible. But the quality is also extremely important for the customer and the user on the site. But so Google will dock me for the photos not being
WebP.
modern web file type, and I can't remember the 2 that they want. And Webflow will not let you upload those file types, so it's hurting my Google score, which obviously hurts. So I don't know the solution, but maybe it's in the future as that evolves a little bit.
I looked into this quite a bit recently because of that same thing. WebP is what they want. And in order to hook it up to Webflow, you have to do this like weird thing where you have to get like a Cloudflare account. You have to get some sort of external hosting. And then you need to like sync those images to, I think you might even need to use like an embed element to then say, hey, I want to pull in this image from this. It doesn't seem like there is there's a seamless way to do it. My understanding of why Webflow doesn't do it, from what I read, was that it's not supported. It's not the de facto image, file type for all browsers. And so they could support it, but then only a portion of the people are going to be able to experience that benefit. So I don't know if there's that. To me, honestly, kind of like how Webflow does the image, like they'll serve up an image that's like an appropriate size. They'll like dynamically, my understanding is they dynamically show you an image that's the right size for your screen resolution, your screen width. It feels like that would be a Webflow improvement where they'd be like, give us whatever file you have. We're going to automatically, depending on the browser, depending on the size, if it supports WebP, we'll do WebP. Otherwise, we're going to fall back to whatever you gave us. That would be the cleanest way, in my opinion, but that's also not my goal.
I have to agree with you. That has been one of my biggest complaints. Because you use all types of tricks trying to minimize your photo and keep it really high res, and then not having able to use a WebP, it's a really, I think there's something is hurting Weflow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that I dropped a YouTube link that's kind of probably a very similar workaround that you were alluding to, Kyle, where like that Gregory goes through like creating an Amazon or an AWS bucket, dropping your images there, and just like essentially loading all your images as embed elements, like so that you can load both the WebP and a fallback JPEG. Because to your point, like Internet Explorer does not support any kind of WebP or modern format. However, yeah, Internet Explorer is well on its way out. So maybe again there will be a near future update that this will be possible, or maybe it'll just happen magically. I don't know. In Webflow.
For everyone else who's on the call right now, last time Corey joined us, he said we were talking about work, what's it called? Workspaces or work?
Yeah, workspaces.
Workspaces,
I think, maybe. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Space, yeah.
And he said, maybe go on the Webflow site tomorrow and just check things out and see if And so I feel like I'm picking up on that vibe right now. I'm
Hey,
not gonna.
nothing is official. Just know that, it's just, there's always possibilities and talk. I mean, because that's the reality. Like, Joy, to your point, like I've seen there's a ton of feedback. Like every time people run Lighthouse scores and stuff, that's always one of the things that gets hit. Like for me, even sites that I have built, I think two things I try to focus on is like, first, like I think Adrian, you mentioned PNG. My personal opinion, at least, is like any photo, I always use JPEGs because you can compress them down much further than PNG. And yes, there's a little more risk for quality loss, but like the file savings to me far outweighs the clarity. And then I dropped a link in the chat to OptiImage is like changed my life as far as a little cheap Mac app that you can just like instantly compress images. You can just like dump a whole bunch in there and even set them to like max file width size to like 2000 pixels and convert it or whatever. It's super powerful. Yeah, I don't know. So like there's ways you can still try to keep them tidy before WebP is a thing, but yes, hopefully, I mean, it's a known need within Webflow. I can say that.
Joe, Corey, I haven't been on this in a while, but I don't know how often they shoot you wish list items under the table.
Hey, I am happy to hear anything. Just, as y'all know, if you've seen the actual Webflow wish list, it's long. Or like lately, it seems like Twitter has just been the wish list domain of like constant. People have a lot of great like lower level ideas. Because I mean, I don't know about y'all, but as a Webflow user, I've been so stoked over the last few months. There's a lot of like quality of life updates, right? Like Flex Gap and some of those things that like aren't actually a incredibly significant engineering lift like something like memberships is. So it's been cool to see, a lot of those things coming out. Because like for us, I feel like they make a huge difference. Like in day-to-day workflow, saving seconds or minutes at a time adds up,
So Flex Gap. I always just I want 3 columns, right? So I set my I've got my container and I'm like 3 columns. I want, okay, give me 31% and I want a percent on either side. And now I've always got 30, and then maybe I set a max width to make sure that it doesn't get too gross. But I used the Flex Gap, and what ended up happening was when things shrunk, because there was that gap, things started breaking from 3 to 2. And so I was sitting here going, when would I ever use Flex Gap?
I think, I don't know to to that specific question without seeing it, right?
Yeah.
But I think the difference is like, how like in Flexbox children, you can like set them to expand or what's the other one where compress, I guess.
Yeah.
If you think about it in context like that, where it's, not necessarily always wrapping context, but things where you want to be able to set that gap from the parent and not within individual children, like you can with Grid. That I would say that's the key benefit. Yeah, and then wrapping, like candidly, I haven't even tried yet, because like even for my own context, any freelance site I've done for the last several years and still do, we use like essentially like the Bootstrap style 12-column grid, but it's all based on Flexbox with the same like naming conventions and all that. But then at Webflow on the brand team, we had a lot of research around if we should use Flex or Grid for our actual layout system, and we do use Grid. So it's like, it's been interesting to like, see both sides. And to me, like, I don't know, it's 6 one, half a dozen the other in so many realms. The only thing I would say is like in the designer, if you have a ton of grids on a page, it will make the designer slower. And that like once you publish, it will be no really performant hindrant thing, but in the designer, it can absolutely make it slower versus using all Flexbox.
And I've got a use case for Kyle. I had a layout that a designer had come up with that was a series of cards where it was a row of 4, a row of 4, and then a row of 3, and they wanted them all centered. And in order to do it, I set up a grid with 4 columns, 2 rows for the top group of 4 and 4. Then I had to do another grid and center it for the other remaining 3. Whereas with the flex gap, I just set a percentage of like 25% on the width of the card and throw in the flex gap and then wrap it, allow it, set the setting to wrap and then center. And it was 4, 4, and 3 with the 3 in the center. And I didn't have to play with any margins or absolute positioning or anything else that I was having to do when it was grid.
I suppose it's, it's one of those things where there's 5 different ways you could do something. And depending on you might come along and go, this flex gap worked great, and you do it and you move on because it was great. And then there might be another time when you have a similar situation and the first thing that comes to mind or the way you just happen to be building at that time is slightly there's not a right way or a wrong way, but that's a good point, Adrian. That was a good use case.
Yeah, and it collapsed pretty well on smaller breakpoints. I just had to change the max width or the min width size on the cards, and they all flowed fluidly. Rather than having to change the gaps on a grid layout and changing the frame size or anything like that. But I've got to bail. It's fun.
I'm gonna say I'm gonna have to go. Kyle, Rachel, Mike, thank you for this. This has been great. Adrian, real quick before I go, in Figma, if you're using a desktop, I know you mentioned something about color management. If you go under the menu and under Figma, select color space, and you have options for sRGB or unmanaged. Unmanaged is the same as you're using untagged color space in Photoshop.
Okay.
So this is something that I battled with because I had come from a print design background, and I always use RGB 98 from RGBs and the Graco for my CMYK. When I made the switch over to UI design, web design, and development, I had a really hard time understanding as why people weren't using color management inside the design. And whenever I would get a design from someone and I will bring it into my system, the colors would never match. And it was just because of that.
Yeah, I've only used the browser. I haven't used the desktop version because I'm usually looking at some clients. When I was designing on my own, I've got Adobe Creative Suite, so I would usually just use XD. But for about the last 18 months, I've been trying to learn Figma more and more and building out things. I've got my own account now instead of just using clients' shared files. But yeah, I'll have to look into calibrating things and using the desktop. But it's interesting. I wonder if you can do that same calibration in the browser version. Have you seen that at all?
I'm pretty sure that you can.
Okay, I'll look into that.
It should be either under your name, like how they have the community, and then it has user. So it's probably under those settings. But on the desktop, you just go to Figma on the top bar.
Yeah, no, I always did that in Photoshop and InDesign and everything, calibrating the screen. But yeah, I haven't. I just noticed a couple of times when I was like exporting files that were graphic illustrations and doing them as SVGs, and I upload them to Webflow, and like, what happened here? That green's not the same shade of green as that.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. I'll take a look at
guys.
that. Appreciate it.
Take care. Great.
Thanks.
Great talk, guys.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.
See ya.
Yeah,
Thank
I'm
you,
gonna head
everyone.
out.
Yeah. Thanks for coming. Good to see everyone again. Hopefully
Good to see you too.
next
This
time.
was great. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya.